is there a kind of a specific order, in your opinion, that organizations should be pulling these things together? Is there like I know it's not, we can't turn everything on and install everything at the same time. It's
Yeah.
important. You're talking about a kind of a boiling the ocean type
Yeah.
scenario. So where do we start with kind of implementing this program, and how do we, what's the kind of process and the kind of timeline look like typically from your experience?
Yeah. And I think what you can look at is take, it's a step back and look at what you have. And a lot of times customers, they're and organizations aren't doing that. Somebody says, well, I need this solution. They go out and buy the solution, or they're going through some sort of RFI, RFP process to say, well, I need some sort of solution to implement because they saw something at, an event, and, they were talking to somebody and like, yeah, I need something like that in place. Well, take a step back. What do you have implemented? Because you might have, an access management product for your MFA and single sign-on. Somebody's implemented it, but you weren't aware, right? And you may have something like a Slack or a Teams in place because another team is using it, right? And I have some sort of directory out there, and well, I want to understand who has access to that Teams or Slack or what have you. So, and somebody's tracking access somehow, right? And does that work for your organization? So I think by taking audit of and tracking all of that information first is a huge first step. And by looking at all of that information and does it fit for what you're looking to implement is hugely important.
So,
And then
kind of like
yeah, but
visibility first, like turning the
yeah,
lights on, really. Yeah.
yeah, because a lot of people don't do that, right? They're not taking action and like you said, right, putting lights on and seeing what's around them, because we all know there's different parts of the organization that like the shadow IT, right, that they had a need, so they're going to fill that need. And by putting lights on all that, they're like, okay, well, maybe that works for the organization. Well, let's do that. And then they can take action on it. And I think from there, then you can start making a decision of, you know, defining what the, I'll say that program charter is to, as we look at zero trust, and maybe they're not calling it zero trust, but they're start going down this path of, at a minimum, we need to track who has access, how they got that access, and, you know, understanding, in the different parts of the organization, and centralizing, being able to provision those things, get away from the shadow IT and bring that access in so other teams aren't granting access into, finance because they needed a tool. They didn't tell IT, right? They didn't tell IT security. So now we have people getting financial access, but there's no controls in place, right?
Yeah.
I think that you need to shut those things down immediately.
Yeah, and we see it, especially in our line of business and the types of conversations we have on a weekly basis. We see this type of thing happening all the time, and even through my career as many years ago as a systems administrator for managed service providers, and they've got their own kind of well, I worked for an MSP, and we serviced a number of different companies globally. And they had their own kind of in-house IT support that would help us. But, and we've all done it, just giving someone excessive privileges to access an application or specific data sets and then not revoking the privileges. And
Right.
yeah, it just becomes, you get permission sprawl everywhere through Active Directory around the data. And then, someone else joins the company and then we copy the user account information and the permissions from an existing employee. And now we've got permission sprawl on that guy. And it's very difficult to understand the implications without having that visibility. So, makes complete sense. Um, the final thing I wanted to ask you. So we've talked majorly about real people, real users, and them manually accessing things. What about the non-human users? We're seeing a lot of kind of it. Well, in nearly all organizations now, we're interacting through APIs. We've got automation. We've got embedded sequences in applications, and everything's written into these kind of small programs to make things more efficient. But again, they're still operating under credentials.
Yeah.
So how can we use this zero trust program to help us become more secure around these non-human users, as it were?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And when we're looking at like you mentioned, right, the APIs, the bot accounts, those non-human type accounts, and it's so easy to just automatically trust them, right? Because I built it. I feel like I did a great job, but all of a sudden I provided it too much access, or in those sequences or the programs that I built, I'm trusting it the entire way, right? I'm trusting it from the outside all the way to the inside through the directory and everything else. And I'm not putting the checks and balances in place. And that's where we need to get away from that. And we need to have those checks in place back to, okay, when somebody accesses the API, externally, because, we're providing those internal applications. I'm trying to make lives easier for our developers, all of those things. We need to be checking, do they truly have access to that next step in the set of activities, right? Do they have, are they authorized to access the server? Do they still have access into each of these areas? And if not, shut it down. And we need to get away from the broader approach from, I created the account, I'm going to trust it from end to end, to breaking it into these micro segments, all the way through that process. And I think that's, it is changing the mindset a little bit, from that end to end into that micro segmentation approach, and looking at our networks that way, and how applications access accounts, or the accounts access different applications that way, and breaking those things in there. And that's what we've seen the rise of microservices for these cloud applications and such, but people aren't looking at it that way for the way they set up applications internally, right? The way that an API accesses a database, or how those bot accounts are using APIs, or running those the little tiny batch accounts, those nightly jobs, and just letting them run wild, right? There's no checks and balances there. So it's really important to put those checks and balances in place there for those accounts across the board. And taking a step back and taking really a view of all of the accounts that we have out there. And I think that's really the next part of that identity security component, is understanding, everybody focuses on the user accounts, the human accounts, or their privileged account, but they're not thinking about all these bot accounts that developers are putting in place, and everything else. And I've talked to customers that have thousands of accounts that are out there, but they're not pulling them in to understand the access that they have, and they're not looking at those types of accounts. And you need to really take that step back and understand those non-human accounts, and really track them and track the access and everything else.
I mean, let's be honest, even in that scenario, if I was going to kind of pick an account to do something with, I'd almost certainly be targeting the kind of service accounts. Just by design, they're usually overprivileged. People shouldn't, but they've usually got administrative rights in the Active Directory, unfortunately. And if I was inside the organization, and I had admin level access, I'm certainly not going to do anything destructive with my own account or another human account. I'm going to do it under service account credentials. So yeah, that makes total sense.
Absolutely.